Welcome, everyone, to the 28th Miami Jewish Film Festival, the largest Jewish film festival in the world. We want to thank all our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers out there, and especially our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support through all these years. My name is Fred Klein, and I have the honor of serving as rabbi at the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. And we're here today speaking with the director, Jonathan York, about the movie that he's produced, Tira, premiering at this year's festival. And thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. So to
Thank you.
start our conversation, Jonathan, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your story, and where you're from?
Absolutely. I grew up here in LA to Iranian immigrant parents who came here in their teenage years and found a new home in America. But I'm in a sort of strange position in that I still have family in Tehran and in Tel Aviv and here in Los Angeles. So I sort of live in this story that I often find myself telling to other people. And these days in particular, it's sort of a strange Venn diagram to fit in that little sliver at the middle there. But it has always allowed me to dive into my family history and my personal history as a toolkit for storytelling and to know how rich and layered our Jewish history is in a way that gives me the context to tell stories in present day. So it has always been part of my upbringing and my Jewish connection to be connected to Israel, and that's ultimately what led to the creation of this film.
So let's just go into that a little bit deeper because you talked about how when you saw the events unfolding on October 7th, you said to yourself, I need to be there. And I think many American Jews, definitely our hearts were there, but you got on a plane and you went to the land of Israel. What motivated you at that moment? What internal force within your heart told you I need to be there? And did you actually plan at that moment that I'm going to make a film and share it with all of us here today?
Well, the short answer to your question is no, I didn't plan to, but now I'll back up and tell you a little bit about how it came about. I probably like you and so many other people, I was at home and watching the news and feeling completely helpless, other than scrolling, for what seemed like an eternity for days and days. And I was watching the news broadcast from Israel and just in horror. And it's frankly, it's strange to think that that was over a year ago now, because I
Yeah.
remember it so clearly, as I'm sure you do. And over the ensuing weeks, I continued to do the same thing, and I felt this weird dichotomy, this dissonance between feeling very much in community, because I'm sure in Miami, as here in LA, people came together and gathered for support and gathered to make a difference and gathered for whatever, it is we do as Jewish people. But in the midst of that community and actually solidarity, I actually felt tremendously lonely because
Mm.
at the same time as all of that was happening, I was really diving in a very personal way, via friends, via family members, via Telegram, and the Israeli news broadcast in Hebrew, the Daily News, into stories in a very human and personal way. And I felt a little bit alone in that. So it was in early December that one Friday night, one of these stories was just the one that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And I purchased a ticket to Israel with no plan, with no real intention other than to feel a little bit less useless than I felt here in LA reading the news. And I didn't know exactly
So
what that would look like, but I thought perhaps I would volunteer or help out, visit some hospitals. And all of that happened, but a lot more happened, obviously.
how are you changed as a human being after going through this journey, both as a human being and as a Jew?
I think I gained a lot of appreciation for the cyclicality of Jewish history. It's funny, in one of the previous screenings of this film that I did actually in Tel Aviv, and it was on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Independence Day. And as my conversation partner after the film, I had Ambassador Michael Oren, who served as ambassador of Israel to the United States, but is a brilliant historian. And he said something very simple, but that hit me like a truck. And he said, John,
Hmm.
this is not some exception to history. This is the norm of history. And you and I both have lived through a sort of vacation from history that started at the end of the Second World War and carried us more or less through our time today, where we've felt safe and relatively secure as Jewish people. But don't forget, you are a part of history. History is not something of the past that occurred and now we study it. And that really that affected me, and that sentiment affected me, to your point, as a person. So it was in that vein on these trips. I've been to Israel 3 times during the war, and on the first of those trips, I made this film merely by being present to so many stories and so many different things that took place on October 7th and in the aftermath. So I visited the kibbutzim and I visited funerals and shivas of people that I didn't know, and I had conversations with ordinary people, taxi drivers, people sitting on the beach. When I got home, I started to realize how much I had to tell. And it was when people would come up to me and ask how was my trip, because I was one of the first people here in my community to visit Israel after October 7th. And I had 20 hours almost of footage on my iPhone. Most of this film was shot on my iPhone, with the exception of the parts where I was interviewed in my home. And it was so frustrating to me not to be able to tell people the full scope of everything I experienced. I'd run into people at a supermarket or at a wedding or at a, some friendly occasion, and I would want to tell them so much more than I could, and I would want to show it to them. And I think it was partly that frustration that led me to say, okay, I have to do something I've never done before, but that I feel fairly confident I can do, which is turn this into a film that tells not a political story. It's not trying to replace the news. It's a very, very personal diary of one man's journey to Israel. And I think that's in some ways what makes it special. I'm not a professional filmmaker as much as I've now caught the bug. And I'm not even a professional Jew. I don't work in that space. I'm an attorney, 33 years old, living in Los Angeles. And it could have been anyone else who took this trip and had these experiences. But I went one step further, and not only went, but I decided to tell these stories. And I think that's part of what has made it really resonate with people. It's that authenticity of it could have been me. And not for nothing, it's shot, I filmed it on this iPhone vertically in an almost kind of habitual, reflexive way. And to show this film across the country on different occasions, I've actually built a vertical screen 14 feet tall out of pipes and taping. And when people see something in a novel format from a novel source, I think it strikes them as something sort of interesting.
I think what's very unique about this film is given the fact that you are both an insider and an outsider, right? You are an American Jew that took part in what is an unfolding drama of the Jewish people in the land of Israel and Eretz Israel, Medinat Yisrael. What was the message that you'd like your fellow American Jews to understand based upon this journey? Because, as you know, most people watching this film probably have not been to Israel in the past year. Many who may see this film have never been to Israel at all. So, what is your message that you want people to take away with them about your journey as an American Jew going to Israel at this critical time?
I think, like many good messages, it's a message of contrasts. On the one hand, it's really time for us to wake up to our reality. And much like I did, I'm not an exception to this, to wake up to the fact that we are not living through some aberration in history. We've returned to the norm of history. And on the bright side, I would say, we should also recognize what an extraordinary people we are, with not only such an amazing legacy to look back to, but in present day, the things that have come about in the last year as a reaction to what happened to us all on October 7th is really inspiring to me and continues to inspire me. the way that people have come together, but also the way that people individually have found a renewed connection to their Judaism or their Zionism, um, or to their essence as human beings, to be kind to one another and to look out for one another. That gives me a lot of hope. So my message would be that there is a lot of work to do, and I hope that everyone at the right time for them visits Israel, because they will get to appreciate with their own eyes how much there is to do. And I suppose that my only other message, because I never want to prescribe to people how to help. I mean, I didn't know that one of my ways of helping this year would be to make a film and tell stories. But I hope that one reaction to seeing this film is that when you get to that fork in the road where you can take some action, however small it may seem, that people go in that direction and take a step.
One of the things that I found very touching in the film is the scene of the Shiva, where Boris is being buried and you decided to go to the Shiva of the family. And you realize that there was just this line of people, hundreds and hundreds of people who probably didn't know Boris either, just like you, coming and comforting the mourners. And you know, when we visit someone, one of the things we say is "Hamakom yenachem etchem." May God comfort you. But the word makom also means the place. And one of the very special things I think about living in Israel, I think, is the fact that every tragedy is a personal tragedy. So indeed, the place does comfort the mourners. Something that I think sometimes in America, people pass away or people suffer, and they're sort of anonymous. We don't necessarily connect. And one of the things that I think is so important about your film is to understand like how small this country is and what mishpacha means, what it means to be a family. Did you want to comment a little bit about those lessons of what it means to be a family, and what you felt in Israel versus when you're back here in America?
It's funny that you bring up that idea of makom, because I spoke about it on a podcast earlier last week, and about that duality of the place and the spiritual presence. And to your point about a certain calmness or a certain feeling, I speak in the film toward the beginning that when I got to Israel, despite everything that was going on, and it was still very much going on at that time, I felt an extraordinary sense of calm. And it was because I was finally in a place where I not only belonged individually, but communally. I could take part in what was going on. It wasn't an accessory to my life. It wasn't something that I could opt into by checking the news and then check out of by putting my phone away. It was the reality of every day and every moment. And something about that was comforting and continues to be comforting. And as I've gone back to Israel, I've had more moments like that. The Shiva was something I never imagined doing. And it was a byproduct of once I had gotten there, feeling like all of this story was my responsibility as well.
Hmm.
That's a very Jewish idea that we're not free to pick and choose to desist from the work, as it said. It was very intimidating. I had no idea if it was appropriate or right, even though I knew it's quite often the practice that people who are not personally familiar, especially in the case of a lone soldier who doesn't have family, would go. I still felt that I was a little less entitled to offer that comfort than someone else. And I'm happy that I went, because it was an exceptional lesson in what it means to be Jewish. And unfortunately, since that Shiva in December, there have been so many hundreds of others. I also attended a funeral in Israel in May of a soldier who was killed in a battle where his father, serving in a reserve unit, had cleared the way for this commando unit to enter. And so this story of loss is communal, it's global as it relates to Jews anywhere in the world, and it's also intergenerational, and it's also linked to history. There is a bitterness in that, but for me as a storyteller, there is also such a richness to draw on in order to meld that grief and that tragedy with a story of who we are. And I hope that in
Yeah.
some way this film achieves that.
Well, one of the things I think is so important about your journey is the fact that Israelis are being seen. And part of your story really talks about you bearing witness to the suffering of other people. As a chaplain, I know very often, people go through trauma, but when people don't recognize the trauma that they're experiencing, they're re-traumatized all over again. And so your very presence, all the way from America, going there to say, I see you, I think is very healing. The first thing that you have in this movie is actually you get off the plane and you're in a taxi cab, and the taxi driver says, how did you get here? And you said, I went on El Al. But he wasn't asking that. Like, why are you here? Was really the question. And I think your film really bears witness to the fact that we, as American Jews, need to witness our fellow Jews in their trauma right now, in their pain, and do everything we can to make sure they're seen. Because as you know, around the world right now, very often Jewish suffering is not being experienced. This film was produced in, I think, December of 2023. Is that correct?
That's right.
So you met a lot of families, and I was wondering if you could give us some updates on the people that you met, some of the hostage families and some of the families of the bereaved. So maybe you could share with us some of the updates that you have.
Unfortunately, in some cases, there's painfully little to share. In the film, I identify Omer Shem Tov as a hostage with whom I developed this sort of strange bond, even though he was in captivity and I had never met him before. Omer remains a hostage, and I hope very much that we'll see him soon. In other cases, this sort of kismet of being present to this story has brought me in touch with people who I talk about in the film or who are actually in the film.
Mhm.
In one of the opening sequences where you hear the news unfolding that day on October 7th, you hear the voice of a 23-year-old girl, Ella Ben Ami, whose father was taken hostage into Gaza. He's unfortunately also still a hostage, but at a rally in Tel Aviv this summer, I had a chance to meet Ella. We ran into each other on the street, and I told her that she was a part of this film, and I felt this gratitude that just somebody across the world was talking not just about the hostages, but about her and her father. And I sent her a copy of the film, and it's been experiences like that which keep this feeling so purposeful for me. I also at various screenings have had people who have been in some tragic or other way touched by this story. I had as a guest of mine a gentleman named Orgat, whose sister, at the time we sat for a conversation, his sister Carmel was being held in captivity. And he and I sat for hours in New York, in Bryant Park and in other places, and we had conversations about how difficult it had been, but he also had this optimism that she would come home. And unfortunately, it was only a matter of weeks later that Carmel was announced to have been murdered, along with Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, and four others, before they were rescued by the IDF.
All right, we all
Flip
remember that
side,
day.
yeah, and so it's strange for me to have had these experiences and then sort of in some small way becomes part of those people's story and their experiences. On the flip side, a few weeks ago, I had another opportunity to sit with someone who was a subject of this ongoing story, a gentleman named Shlomi Ziv, who was held hostage for 8 months before he was rescued in that unbelievable mission in June, where Noah Argamani and three others were rescued. And there's this unbelievable, helmet camera footage that we've all seen at this point. And so that's a story with a happy ending, but there's so much gray even in the stories that end well. I've been around so many of these other people, and even that happiness is tinged with a sense you can say it even if it goes unsaid, that they're not exactly the same people anymore. And there's a part of them that is always going to be missing and traumatized, to say the very least.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about that, joy that you mentioned, because if you've been to Israel, and I have been to Israel a few times as well, people go to parties still. Sometimes the restaurants are open in Tel Aviv.
People who are resilient in a way we can't understand, and they manage to fuse happy and sad, grief and celebration. But seeing it for myself was really, it was a trip, and it was really uncomfortable at first. On that first visit, I was not sure why people were on the beach and why people were continuing to laugh and get together in small ways. But that's what it means to be Israeli. I mean, there is this ever-present need to bring happiness into your life, even when it's the most uncomfortable and feels the most inappropriate. But I would even say that that's what it is to be Jewish. I mean, for thousands of years, it's been forced upon us, this sort of lesson in how to commingle tragedy and daily joy, as I talk about in the film. And you know that at a Jewish wedding, we break the glass, and in doing so, we're marking our lowest point, the destruction of the temples, and our absolute bottoming. And then we immediately say Mazel Tov, and we dance and we celebrate. And on Purim, we're in costume and we're cursing our enemy and celebrating our heroes in the same breath. That's what it is to be Jewish. I went back intentionally to Israel this year on Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. And for those who don't know, that's Israel's Memorial Day and Independence Day, and they're back to back. I mean, literally, because Jewish holidays begin in the evening, in the same waking day, most Israelis, and their Memorial Day is not about barbecues or sales or anything else. It's going to cemeteries and it's reading names and it's sitting in silence and remembering people. And for everyone, that's someone very personal and immediate. And then they transition to this absolute celebration in the streets. And I wanted to experience what that would be like this year in particular, with everything that is so strange about this year. And I was leaving actually a rally for the hostages, and it was transitioning at that time of day to Yom HaTzmaut. And so I went to Rothschild Boulevard in the middle of Tel Aviv, and it was an absolute celebration. And there were mainly, I would say, young people celebrating the street.
Mhm.
And it occurred to me that many of those people celebrating the street were 16 and 17 years old, meaning they were just before the age where they would have felt the heaviness, the weight of an IDF uniform. And they have not yet been to funerals of people dying in combat who they went to high school with. It hasn't become real in that way for them. So this crowd was celebrating, and off in the corner of my eye, I saw a woman sitting on the steps. This was a middle-aged woman, and she was holding up a sign, a handmade sign. And it said in Hebrew, "Remember your brothers and sisters who are in captivity, who can't celebrate their independence this year." And that scene just sort of tore at me. And then I turned around 5 minutes later, again, there to observe as I do. And this woman had left the steps and come into the thick of this celebration. And she was talking with a young Israeli girl, again, 16, 17 years old. And I saw this conversation turn into a debate, and the debate then turned into an argument until they were really, I would say, at each other's throats. Although, Israelis, so probably afterward, one was invited, the other's home for Shabbat. But in the moment, it was really, really intense. And this woman, who I then found out was a mother of a hostage, was was saying, how can you be here celebrating? How can you be rejoicing when you know where they are? And this young girl shot back and she said, that's why we have to be here. Otherwise, we've lost. Otherwise, we've been defeated. We are still here and we're still strong and we can still defend ourselves. So we have to be here. And the heartbreak of that scenario, of that situation, is that neither one is right and they're both right. And I was just left torn in half, but that's what I went there to experience. And um, that for me, that scene was everything you've asked about in a nutshell.
Yeah, one of the things I think when we go to Israel right now is all of these conflicting feelings at the same time. It says in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a time to rejoice and a time to cry, but there are times where we're rejoicing and crying at the same time. And something that I think if you've been to Israel in the past year, you've felt that on a personal, visceral level. The last question I wanted to ask, you named the film Al Tira. First of all, what does the word Al Tira mean? And why did you decide to name this film Al Tira?
Well, the fun linguistic thing about Al-Tira is based on if you spell with a hey or with an aleph, Al-Tira with a hey is a more contemporary word and it means don't shoot. Al-Tira, as it's spelled in my film with an aleph, is a more biblical word and it means do not fear. And it is a little bit ironic to call a film about war and terrorism and grief and tragedy, Do Not Fear. But there's a purpose for that. And it has to do with what we've been talking about. Because despite everything that I saw and that I've seen on my subsequent visits, and I don't need to tell you or any of the viewers that this story is not over. We are living in it still every day, and sometimes it feels like it's speeding up. And when I went to December, I thought maybe we're a few months from the end of this story, and we were really at the beginning. Nonetheless, my takeaway, my overarching feeling each time that I've been in Israel is that we're going to be okay. And that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take the sort of waking up to reality that I wish for all of us collectively. But it was in part all of the stories of heroism. And I'm not talking about people who we expect to be heroic, the soldiers and the first responders and the volunteers of Zaka that you saw in the film. I'm talking about normal people. I'm talking about those taxi drivers that you saw in the film. I had two taxi drivers in the space of 1 week in Tel Aviv who told me that on October 7th, they took their personal firearm and they took their personal car, drove down to the kibbutzim, and helped fight off the terrorists until the army arrived. When you hear stories like that, you cannot help but say, we're in good hands. And part of I'll make a plug for the current generation, the young generation, because for years, there was this trope about this generation that they were not the generation of the War of Independence or of Yom Kippur or of the First Lebanon War. They hadn't been through the fire, so to speak, and been tested and proven themselves. Instead, they were derided as the TikTok generation and the iPhone generation, a group of more or less narcissistic kids who didn't know what it was really like to earn your place in that legacy. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And when things happened this year in October and since, that generation has stepped up in the most extraordinary way and really entered the pantheon of not just Israeli history, but Jewish history. And to the extent that that is our future, those are our future leaders and warriors. I continue to think and say that we're going to be okay. And at the end of the day, there's nothing to fear. So that's Al-Tira.
So it's such a beautiful ending, and I hope I was inspired by your film, Jonathan. It's really moving and it reminds us of the spirit of the Jewish people, the resilience that we have as a people, even in the face of tragedy. And as we are interviewing today on the 26th of November, my hope is that in the next hour, even, that we see all of those hostages return to their family quite soon. And the stories that you started talking about have a happy ending, reunited with their families. So I want to thank you, Jonathan, for for joining us today. And once again, thank you to all our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially again, our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all of these years. Thank you, our audience, for participating in the 28th Annual Miami June Festival. Shalom.